And I think the Chinese want not only us, but they want the world to know that they're inside. And I think that's problematic, not only from an actual cyber perspective and the ability to cause disruption, destruction, listening to our telephone conversations, or staying our systems and stealing data as they see fit, but they want us to know they're there.
Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and this week we have the privilege to sit down for a special episode. It's on a report we are releasing on the various typhoons perpetrated by the People's Republic of China, and I have with me the four co-chairs of that particular task force. First Admiral Mark Montgomery, then Brad Medairy, and then Bill Evanina. All three of whom have actually been on previous podcasts, and all three are also senior fellows. So really excited about today's conversation. Want to be able to take a complex set of issues and bring it to the American people. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining today. So this is our report. It is released today, and I think it really drills down into the various typhoons and tries to put it into plain spoken language and answer, hopefully, the why it matters. But I thought before we jump into the report itself, we've seen a whole lot of activity coming out of China. The landscape continues to move. The tactics, techniques, and procedures continue to change. But Mark, I thought maybe a little bit of a background on its evolution, if you want to kick us off there.
Yeah, thanks. First, it's an honor to be here with Brad and Bill and you, and with the all McCrary team here of senior fellows and director. Listen, this is a great report, but you're right. You kind of need to understand up front just what a threat China is to us. And we just put out our annual assessment, and one of the things you'd hear Senator Angus King would say was one thing that's been true in all 5 assessments is each year we can say the threat has grown. And I would say the leading driver of that growth in the cyber threat environment in the United States is China. Second is probably criminals, and then you would get to the other nation states. So China is a big driver. And I think it's important for us to understand what an important role cyber malicious activity plays in China's overall national security strategy. I think when Chairman Xi thinks about recapturing Taiwan, while there may be thoughts about a cross-strait invasion, his realistic dreams involve a cyber-enabled economic warfare campaign, with the emphasis being on the word cyber. He'll use diplomatic and economic and other tools, but in the end, they'll leverage cyber malicious activity and influence operations that are themselves the product of cyber activity to break the societal resilience of Taiwan. So from my perspective, a study that examines the Chinese threat and the particulars, the tactical particulars of how it does it, is important because it helps reaffirm what we all know to be the operational and strategic nature of the Chinese threat to the United States.
Perfect segue. Bill, over the span of your career, how have the tactics, techniques, and procedures changed? How have you seen the modus operandi change and coming at it from both your time at the FBI and then running the National Counterintelligence Directorate?
I think when you just to amplify Admiral's perspective on China and the strategic perspective, I think that's where it starts with strategy. I think when Xi came in, he decided to make this a strategic intent of one of their main pillars of how they're going to combat and compete with the United States, both civilian and militarily. I would say over that span, I'm going to say the last 15 years, a couple things come to mind. Number one is complexity, and the persistence and the persistence of where they're going and how they do it is astronomical. 2, the strategic intent of how they do things, why they do things, and where they're targeting is number 2. 3, the frequency and scale for which they attack the United States and other entities around the world is really, really impressive. But lastly, I think the most important change I've seen in 15 years has been the targets of their attack. It started out, I would say, late 09, 10, where they were mostly government targeting. Then it transitioned into defense industrial base because they were the main components of how we facilitated our military operations. And then Xi came in and they changed. They saw the vulnerability of our private sector, our academia, our research institutions, I would say our non-Title 50s. So the spread and the vastness of how they facilitated their target, not only their surface targets, but the actual entities in private sector, allowed them to utilize some of these typhoons, specifically to attack not only from a cyber espionage perspective, but data aggregation, data theft, and also theft of intellectual property and trade secrets to facilitate both their civilian and military capabilities.
And fair to say, everyone's a target, right? Very few sectors that haven't been targeted.
That's correct.
Brad, Booz has put out a number of good reports on China recently. And why are these reports important? Why does it matter?
Yeah, I think to some extent, as a nation, I think we've become sort of, cyber attacks are the norm. And, every day we're reading about something new. Just recently, the F5 vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And so we read about it and then we move on. And Mark talked about it. And I would say that with China, we see continued escalation. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to look at it as an entire body of work. And when you look at that, you see this continued escalatory behavior. China is using cyberspace to project power. As a nation, I think that we need to recognize this threat. I remember talking to someone in the administration and about the threat, and I'm like, how do we make a dent in this? And the feedback, it was actually pretty profound. He's like, look, we need to educate the public. We need to understand what the threat is, who is the threat, and then we can start to build consensus around how to combat it and how to defeat it. I think about myself, a child of the 80s, right? I knew the threat. It was Russia. And I think if you ask the general population today, they're going to say, well, Russia is still the threat. And the reality is China is the threat of our generation. And I think that we need to create that awareness, and we need to have an integrated strategy to combat that.
I would just add, yes, but Russia's still there, but
100%,
you're absolutely
100%.
And I would commend to you Booz's October 2025 report. I think it's one of the best ones I've read recently.
Yeah, and let's sort of paint, and in our report we go into great detail on all of the various typhoons. We'll pick on the big three for today. Volt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon, Salt Typhoon. We also have Linen. We also have Violet. We also have Nylon, and on and on and on. And probably by the time this episode is aired, we'll have a new one. But Mark, I thought we'd start at the very beginning with Volt Typhoon, because I think that was the one that, at least from my perspective, raised all sorts of alarm bells. But you want to give a quick?
Sure. And as leading into that, I'll just say this report, the goal of this report, slightly different than the Booz report, is to very specifically provide a primer on this one set of advanced persistent threat axis, the typhoons from China. So if you're working on the Hill, if you're in the administration, if you're in a company, if you're in a trade association, this is should be required reading for understanding what is the most significant set of threats coming to the United States. Not in any way take away from the Booz report, which really looks at the broad perspective of threats to the United States. So dig into this if you want to understand typhoons. And so first one, Volt Typhoon. Volt Typhoon, as a military officer, military planner, this is the easiest for me to understand. I call it operational preparation of the battlefield. It is the Chinese examining our critical infrastructures, determining what are the targets most important to impinging on our national security, and I think particularly military mobility, our economic productivity, and our public health and safety. And we're pretty convenient. We lay out what our risk areas are. In other words, if I go to U.S. Transcom in a very transparent, unclassified way, says here are my 69 strategic airfields. Here are my 17 strategic seaports. Here's my 20,000 miles of strategic rail network. Now, DoD does this, Department of Defense does this for a reason, which is to try to get the Department of Homeland Security, the Coast Guard, and TSA, the Transportation Security Agency, who, if you didn't know, is responsible for the security of your rail networks, to get them interested in it, to get them engaged on it. Now, the Department of Defense's real strategy is not to pay for it. And so they identify these things. Well, I get it. Coast Guard and TSA know what's strategic now. So does China. And then if you back up and look at former FBI Director Wray's very accurate and transparent testimony to the China Select Committee about 18 months ago, he very clearly stated China went after exactly those kind of systems that were critical to military mobility and national security, and then the ones that are critical to economic productivity and public health and safety that underpin that. So not just rail, aviation, ports, but also energy, water, and financial services. So look, China is doing operational preparation of the battlefield is to either disrupt or destruct these critical infrastructure networks during either the buildup to a crisis to signal to us, stay out, America, or during a crisis to kneecap our ability to respond rapidly.
So to very simply, you have military mobilization, which is anything that could impede the ability to project power, deploy forces, move troops, personnel, and everything else, down to other critical infrastructure that could be held hostage at a time of their choosing. Yes, no?
It is. Let me say one last thing. You remind me, really easily, if I want to get a tank from Fort Hood, Fort Cavazos to Korea, it gets on a tank rail car at Fort Hood, Fort Cavazos, and that base has got 2 power systems, 2 comm systems, 2 water systems. It's the Noah's Ark of critical infrastructure, right? It leaves the base and it enters like Uncle Rufus's Rural Rare Collective number 27.
You love Uncle Rufus.
I do, but Uncle Rufus, he says, my job is to clear that 50 miles of track of dead animals, not maintain the cybersecurity of the network that propels it. The Chinese are like, we can attack Fort Hood, Fort Cavazos, which might be hard, DISA's working it, or I could go after Uncle Rufus, and they go after Uncle Rufus, and we don't have a system for TSA to even help Uncle Rufus assess his systems. And there's lots of these rural rail, that the rail system is not run by 4 or 5 big companies. Like there are 4 or 5 big rail cargo companies, lines, but there's hundreds of owners of the track. That's who we have to help, and they're not going to be regulated into a helpful solution. They're going to have to be incentivized with grants and other programs, particularly in these rural networks where these are not Fortune 500 companies masquerading as local utility.
Mark, this brings me back to when we were first working together early in the Clinton administration, when there was this belief that you had a global information infrastructure, you had a national information infrastructure, and a defense information infrastructure. The reality is they're all blending, right? Brad, I mean, the next one probably, and still early innings to know exactly the consequences and the impact. More understandable because it's a large espionage campaign, but Salt Typhoon, you want to paint a picture of that?
Yeah, so Mark described Volt Typhoon as operational prep of the battlefield. If kind of continuing along those lines, I would say Salt Typhoon is really gaining the strategic high ground for intelligence. And here is where we saw, PRC, threat actors, embedding in telecom networks globally across 80 nations. And, there's evidence that this started as early as 2019. And it was really a multi-year espionage campaign. They were able to embed themselves in the telecom network. They were able to get call data, metadata, information around lawful intercepts, which means they were able to figure out who were being tracked in terms of criminals and spies. And it's really kind of the strategic high ground, right? Because from an espionage perspective, if you're in the telecom networks, you can actually see
and who's
talking.
not.
Yeah. And so really significant campaign, went on for a long time. In the U.S., 9 telecom companies, Verizon, AT&T, Charter Communications, and we've seen evidence, right? Heavily focused in the D.C. area, political figures, and really significant campaign that took us years to uncover.
And I think, again, the full damage assessment is very early, but even without having all the information, that's a pretty darn bad day, right? I mean, to know who we're interested in clearly is of interest to the adversaries.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, if you're able to get into the telecom networks and look at the lawful intercept data,
Yep.
then you can actually see who the U.S. may be watching from a spy perspective, and that's a huge national security issue. The other key thing,
It's like having the offensive and defensive coordinators' playbooks.
definitely,
right?
definitely. And the other thing is, we use the word APT, Advanced Persistent Threat, right? Salt Typhoon was uncovered in around October 2024, but that doesn't mean they're going to stop. Right? This is going to be a multi-year campaign, a game of cat and mouse, and we're going to continue to see attempts to attack and infiltrate U.S. and our allies and global telecommunication networks.
Awesome.
Frank, add one thing on this too. There's a great description. I attach myself to everything Brad said. What I'd say also is that Salt Typhoon caused me to no longer trust kind of the judgments I'd necessarily drawn on critical infrastructures. If you'd asked me a year before it, what are the critical infrastructures in the best condition, I'd have put energy, defense industrial base, financial services, communications, somewhat
very
ahead
top.
of the other ones.
Yep.
I think what I learned in this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the communications network, what I misunderstood was the security of the corporate network, the telecommunication system, where they protect important stuff, our PII, our credit card details, things like that. That's secure. That has a lot of invested in it. They're trying hard to protect that to keep us as customers. What equally to keep us as customers, when it came to the core network, the guys operating are like, hey, what's that cybersecurity change you want to put in here? Is it going to slow me down? Is it going to make me less efficient? Did my competitors at Verizon or AT&T have to put that same thing in? And when I think at some level the ability to impose cybersecurity on the core network lagged the desire to put cybersecurity on the corporate network. And therefore, our telecommunications infrastructure was less secure than any of us would have hoped. And that worries me because that kind of decision making could be happening in other infrastructures, and we don't really understand it.
You and me both. And I'm sorry, Brad, but I go back to the 90s where the cartels were buying telecommunications companies. It's the ultimate, why break in if you can own? In essence, they owned it.
Yeah. I mean, I think a common pattern between Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon is, as a nation, we have a tremendous amount of technical debt. And I mean, I think the strategic question is, with all of that technical debt, we can't modernize everything. And so that technical debt leaves some of our most critical infrastructure inherently insecure.
Absolutely.
And so, how do we win?
If I might just add, like as a law enforcement and intelligence professional for 25 years, I find Salt Typhoon to be personally insulting because they're all insulting. But in my world, back a couple decades, in order to listen to an American's telephone call, you had to get a FISA application, a Title III. You had to have a judge sign off on the ability to listen to a U.S. citizen's telephone calls. Now we're in a situation where we have a foreign adversary listening to telephone calls of Americans as they see fit. That's
scary.
It's scary.
Yeah, it is. And it is insulting. That said, that one is understandable. It's espionage. And I don't want to tip a hat, but that's a little different, I think, than Volt. And we'll get to intentions in a second. But one of the other big typhoons is Flax Typhoon. Can you walk us through that a little bit, Bill, and anything you want to add on Volt and Salt as well? But start
I'm with
Flax.
both of my colleagues here in terms of insulting and aggravating on the Volt Typhoon. I think as Americans, we should all be very clear to not only the consequences here, but the intentions. Now, Flax, I would say, if you looked at the metaphor of three angry brothers here, one out to disrupt, dismantle, and destroy critical infrastructure, one out to not only spy and listen to telecommunications. Flax is a little bit more interested in the long-term / mutual fund consequences of what the typhoons are doing. Flax Typhoon is an ability for the Chinese ATP groups to live off the land, get into critical infrastructure, whether that be government, intelligence organizations, technology organizations, you name the critical infrastructure, and get in through legitimate means, have the ability to stay inside the systems, credentialing, how they want to float around, with the prime intention to identify key data sets, information, intelligence, take what they need when they want to see it, but be there for a long time. Because what they found out in OPM and other breaches is that sometimes when you go in for the bottle of water, there might be a beer in there. and there might be wine coming down the road. So I think what they look at is if we can get into a critical infrastructure, we could stay there, be persistent, be quiet, be unfound for a long time. The data sets and the theft from an espionage perspective can be really fruitful more down the road than they are right now.
And that you bring up a very important point, that it's not only discriminatory information you're pursuing, very specific information, but it's the data itself, right?
It's the data itself. And look back to some of the ATPs, and not necessarily would not be classified as Flax Typhoon, but you look at the Chinese arc of attempts when they were going company by company, but then they realized, well, wait a minute here. If we breach a cloud service provider, we get lots of companies. Right, so then they were breaking glass, and we found them. But now with the Flax Typhoon, as part of this, very vicious typhoon family, their abilities to hide in plain sight, be a credentialed entity inside a company, a critical infrastructure, is not only disturbing, but it's very, very difficult for CISOs and CIOs around the country to identify them and extricate them from the facility.
And also included a number of IoT and IIoT devices, which demonstrate a level of sophistication, and also finding the seams in older generational forms of technology that have been knitted together through the cloud and other means, right?
Absolutely.
So, let's talk intent now. Not all hacks are the same, not all hackers are the same, not all intentions are the same, not all capabilities are the same. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but each one of these typhoons on their own is a significant national security concern. Collectively, it basically shows across the board, military, economic, diplomatic, it's a strategic. These aren't one-offs. These aren't one-off incidents. Collectively, it tells a pretty damning story. What would you say in terms of intentions, and pick on the three or any of the other typhoons we didn't have time to discuss here?
I think it's important for the audience to understand that you probably don't want to pick one of the three. I think you have to look at them in totality.
The story, right?
And I think the story is, to your initial comments, Frank, we're talking about 3 typhoons right here, but there are many more, and many more, and a lot of these typhoons touch multiple parts of our critical infrastructure and our government entities collectively and individually. And I think you have to look at it as, from a strategic intent, what is Xi and the Communist Party trying to achieve with this? From a perspective of what they're doing, it's also why. They're okay with getting caught. So far, as we all know, the consequences of getting caught have been minimal at all, right? So for me, getting in and making our private sector and our government know they're there is a problem, and then trying to find them. We exhaust resources and capabilities. We're always trying to patch 0 days. And I think the Chinese want not only us, but they want the world to know that they're inside. And I think that's problematic, not only from an actual cyber perspective and their ability to cause disruption, destruction, listening to our telephone conversations, or staying our systems and stealing data as they see fit, but they want us to know they're there.
It's
and
goading.
I think
Goading,
there's a
right?
lot of that. Hey, when Xi wants to be the global power on all things, some of that is the world to know that he can do this.
Absolutely. Brad, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're seeing, the early days of, the future of warfare. The integration of, in the past we talked a lot about kinetic warfare. The future of warfare is going to be an integrated non-kinetic and kinetic fight. Mark talked about prepping the battlefield. Through escalatory cyber activity, when Volt Typhoon, when China's pre-staging capabilities for no other effect than to disrupt and dismantle our critical infrastructure, that is projecting power, it's imposing cost, and it's creating doubt. And it's not going to stop.
Mark? And why should Americans care?
Yeah, that's great. And so
I care.
I do. And all 4 of us do. And I think lots of Americans care, but they just don't know how to care.
Yeah.
So Bill had it exactly. When Bill was talking, I was thinking about our mutual friend Angus King, Senator Angus King from Maine, who could not ever get off the idea that we don't deter attacks in cyberspace. That
we don't do enough.
We don't do enough.
I'm with Angus.
That the level of use of force, the level of pain we would have to suffer before we did something in cyberspace, before we did something back in cyberspace or kinetically, is so high as to be ineffective.
Yep.
And then when I think about Volt Typhoon, there's the perfect description. You and I have had this discussion before. If the Chinese were to take 1,000 backpacks of 5 pounds each of Semtech of explosive, strap them to the same port, rail, aviation power grids, and the FBI were to discover this, we would hold them kinetically accountable in some way, and we would probably, we would have a complete breach in our diplomatic relations.
Absolutely.
And we would get our allies and partners, we would say, this is a go, no go in your relationship with us, that you will join us in this economic pain that we're about to put on them, or this kinetic pain that we're about to put on them. That would be, an act of war. But in cyberspace, it's perceived as, hey, that was somebody might have caught what Director Wray said. The vast majority of Americans don't care what's said at congressional commissions. They don't read those articles. And so China's getting away with a lot of provocative behavior. And they're setting a bar of what we probably have to accept in a crisis or contingency, because we've accepted it prior and we won't want to appear to be escalatory. That's the ugly, the kind of the
But
most.
how can we be more escalatory? What more could they do?
I think first of all, you have to respond every time. If you don't, you establish a new bar of acceptable behavior. That's what drives
and others
crazy.
who are watching.
That's right.
How you respond.
Think
right?
about Sony. What North Korea did to us, and then it took us like 4 months to attribute it. It took us about a year to do something back. And what we did back was we indicted 3 or 4 North Korean military officials who I'm confident were immediately invited to Pyongyang for their award ceremony. And no one was extradited, and we knew no one would be extradited. So it was almost like theater.
It was Seth Rogen's movie that triggered
I will
it,
say,
right?
to amplify the Admiral's point, I think when we look back the last 15 years, when we attributed the PLA attacks in 2014, it was a big deal in the interagency, because no one wanted to attribute to a nation-state threat actor that there was this, and on the global scale, Xi was really embarrassed, right? Embarrassing an emperor was a big deal. So the next 4 or 5 years, up to the infamous meeting, the Rose Garden, attributing these things to the Chinese Communist Party and Xi was a big deal for us. It really made a difference, and that was not necessarily a deterrent, but it made us feel good. The indictments of people who were never come out of China was just a waste of time. Now, because it's happening so frequently, even the embarrassment on a global stage is problematic, because Xi and the CCP don't care anymore. So I think, to Mark's point, we have to find new ways to push back. And you look back even to the OPM data breach, 20 million Americans have, and then more importantly, Equifax, when every American had all their financial data stolen by the Communist Party of China, because they wanted algorithms and business processes. We have to find a way to fight back, because as Mark mentioned, that level gets larger. And the last point I'll think about this, as Americans, you'll think back to 9/11, our want to retaliate is predicated upon the loss of human life. And until we have lives that are lost because of a Volt Typhoon shuts off an energy grid and people die because they're freezing to death, I don't see a policy that comes forward that has enough strength that Angus King would like, that we could put some pressure and deterrence on the Communist Party of China.
That reminds me, I'm glad you brought that up. I used to say, I agree with you, that people have to perceive that there's loss of life. We do have loss of life in cybercrime, in ransomware, on hospitals.
Absolutely.
There's an absolute 26% morbidity rate change in the hospital over that 5 weeks. Now, I'm going to be careful how I say this. We all have elderly relatives. But the people who are dying in hospital are elderly people, and if 4 90-year-olds die instead of 3, it's very hard to have accountability for that one was the one. Now, if you're in an ambulance headed up to a hospital that's had ransomware in its ER, and you have to go to another one 10 miles away and you die en route, your family's got a good lawsuit. But until we have more and more experience of this, I think we all know the companies we talk to, their desire to do cybersecurity work is directly tied to the last incident they had occur to them, or a neighbor close enough that they trust their reporting. We have to be able to make a compelling message that what happens in criminal behavior, what happens here with Volt Typhoon, matters to you as Americans, whether it's to you personally or to the critical infrastructure you rely on. Until people believe that it matters to them, we're not going to get the kind of actions we need, and the Senator Kings of the world will be disappointed in the response they get to requests for actions to support deterrence.
I think probably the biggest, I remember back on Colonial Pipeline when they were attacked with ransomware, and it shut down almost the entire East Coast from a travel perspective for 4 or 5 days. It's really significant. And so I think that that started to condition the public, but that's long out of sight now. And so there have been some other events like the meat packing plant. I remember my kids were upset because they couldn't have Chipotle one day, but the reality is we haven't really seen the implications of cyber effects on our everyday life.
Or people don't see how the unintended consequences.
Well, that's a great one on the agriculture. The meat packing plant's a perfect one. So Colonial happens, we actually got changes to pipeline cybersecurity because enough people were pissed. And there was enough repeat CBS and 60 Minutes, and it went on and on. Because
I think we had a piece in NBC.
Yeah, United. Yeah. So, but on the food and on the meat processing, because it went away without like a couple picnics might have gotten ruined, but the reality is came and went rapidly. If you look at the Department of Agriculture, they've done nothing. 4 years later, they're still spending $250,000 on critical infrastructure support to the private sector, which us government officials know is one full-time equivalent, one human being running a website. It's not how you support tens of thousands of farms, food processing plants, shipping plants. So you're absolutely right. It has to be, unfortunately, what the American public needs to take action is 4 days of no gas at the pump, flights canceled, people pissed. Then you get action. And unfortunately, and even then, it does dissipate over time. I would prefer that the government solves issues without getting kicked in the teeth repeatedly.
You and me both. It sounds similar to getting the government open. It takes some of these. But Brad, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just, I mean, like this last conversation, I mean, I think we all hit on it, right? The strategic question is, what is the red line? And then what happens when you cross it? I just don't think we have a good or a consistent answer for that. And I think that's something nationally we need to address.
And we are addressing that in our National Security Task Force.
Just to again, double down on Brad's comment, I think also the government has to be careful that as things happen and occur at a more frequent and more devastating pace. And on the Volt Typhoon, Mark's perspective, what happens if someone does die and we have multiple deaths, or hypothetically we have a train derailment and it's attributed back to China and no one? I don't want to see U.S. companies retaliating against the Chinese, right? And I think at the end of the day, there'll be enough pressure that someone wants to retaliate independently, and the government needs to be able to do that prior to U.S. businesses, and because they can, we can't allow that to happen.
Good point. That is a big discussion we've covered and want to as well. But I want to turn to this week. President Xi is likely sitting down with President Trump and in South Korea, and in all likelihood, critical minerals is going to dominate the discussion. A lot of trade discussion. Where should cyber fit into all of this?
Well, it's not gonna. I mean, that's the truth. I mean, the truth is it's not the hot top. Right now, there are a number of hot topics: critical minerals, tariffs, oil purchases from Russia, support to Taiwan. I do not think you're going to get through those thicket of issues to get to cyber. Should it be on the table? Yes. Will it be on the table? Almost certainly no.
Brad, any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think Mark hit it well.
Bill?
I just want to amplify. I think when you look at the current ongoing dynamics of discussion that's going to be predicated by this meeting, cyber is probably 37th on the list. However, it depends on how you bring it up to the president, right? If you approach the president, hopefully his advisors are talking about Volt Typhoon and using the metaphors that Mark talked about those backpacks of explosives on critical infrastructure, the way you talk about it matters. And then, the $600 billion a year we're losing on intellectual property theft. But I think that number will get the president motivated to at least bring it up as a talking point. I agree. I don't think it's going to be, but I think there are ways to get the president of the United States motivated to use these talking points.
Yeah, if you could monetize the impact of China's aberrant behavior, that's probably I think that's the most easy way to get to this president. He does not like getting money taken from him or stolen, or the perception that someone got a better deal.
But it is having massive economic implications.
So you got to get that, like Bill said, someone's got to get that story across.
And again, the process is unknown currently how that works. How do the advisors get to the president? How does the intelligence community, CISA, how do talking points get there? It's changed new world. But I think if the president knew that just from the theft of intellectual property and trade secrets is $4,000 per American family after 4, I think the president can use that talking point, right? I think it's important for him to understand that the monetization of cyber is real.
As a cyber community, we tend to think about the cost that we incur in terms of infrastructure modernization and cyber defense, and then we tend to talk about the risk it poses to our citizens, but we never actually talk in general about the cost it imposes to us from a business perspective, right? If you look at the next-gen Chinese strike fighter, right, it looks a lot like the F-35. Well, that's a tremendous amount of cost avoidance that they had by through espionage, right? If you look at the drug community in terms of all the the formulas that have been stolen and reproduced in China, you can actually quantify and measure the economic impact there. It's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, that reminds me, and I'm not volunteering you or I for this since we've done our commission time, but the Blair Commission needs a refresh.
Blair did a great job.
He did. Admiral Blair's commission on the cost of intellectual property theft writ large, of the kind of cyber-enabled intellectual property theft writ large, was very useful. I do think it's getting dated. I think the numbers are high.
6 years ago, 8 years ago.
It had some updates like ours, but it is old now. I think that needs to be, and the beauty of that is that coming out and being put on the president's desk. That, as Bill implied, I think that's how you get it to him. I'm not saying that the intelligence community should do it. I think that might be. I don't know if that'd be distracting or not for him, but someone needs to be doing that work, and it needs to be unclassified. I know they won't like to hear this, but if the government does it, it has to be unclassified. It can have a classified annex to show a few nitnoid things, but the broad truth, not just I'll have some part that's unclassified. The actual argument has to be unclassified because you have to make it to congressmen who don't work well, and
you have to make it to the American people.
You have to make it to the people. Press.
I would proffer that the information. I concur wholeheartedly that message can be brought to the president by the Business Roundtable, Jamie Dimon and crew. They're the ones that are victimized by this intellectual property theft. Their banks, their holdings, the private equity and venture capital people that are investing in technology and AI development who are continuing to be victimized. I think that message is strong enough the president to get motivated by, to be able to use that as an underpinning. And also, if you want to get the president motivated by the previous administrations, he could talk about how Xi embarrassed Obama in the Rose Garden, right? And don't let that happen to you, Mr. President. I think there are some ways to motivate the president to use cyber with the big C as part of one of these talking points this week.
I also think just in terms of educating the public, right? We've been talking for, the cyber community by nature are fear mongers, right? And so we've been talking about like a cyber 9/11 or a cyber Pearl Harbor for 15 or 20 years, right? Yet nothing's happened. And so people are just skeptical. Oh, this cyber thing, everyone keeps saying it's going to be bad, but I don't see anything. I can't touch or feel it. But when you start talking about the economic impact, it's measurable, and it's a way to actually, I think, connect with the public when you say, oh, this is how much money, this is the economic cost to us as a nation. It's much easier, I think, to rally support and get people's minds wrapped around it.
And it's jobs, and it's innovation, and it's why people wake up elsewhere in the world wishing they were born in the United States, not Beijing. So I think there's a lot to that as well. 2027 is around the corner. What should we be thinking? And this is lightning round.
Well, first of all, as I've told you, the actual year is now 2030 because we made investments, but the metaphorical 2027. I would actually make, just for our discussions, 2028 is the right year. That's the re-election, the election in Taiwan, and the beginning of our own presidential elections. I think that's prime hunting ground for Xi. So when I think about that time, we have three elements to get better. Industry's investment in cybersecurity, the government's investment in being a good partner, and the actual execution of that collaboration. All three legs of that stool have got to get stronger year over year. You can't just have 10 banks kicking ass. You can't just have regulation that's successful in nuclear power and in flight safety. We need to have, and we can't just have incentivization and grant programs in electricity because their congressional committees are more effective at getting it into the appropriations. You got to consistently have all three legs of the stool strong across 16 or 19 or 20 critical infrastructures, however you count them. That's how you're successful. And all of that is iterative and boring, and the hard work of governing a country that needs an executive branch and a legislative branch working on it.
And I might note, Mark's doing, you're doing some really important work, tabletops and exercises between U.S. and Taiwan. So thank you for that. Brad?
Yeah, as I think about the next couple of years, we've talked here consistently about escalation. And, in the past, cyber was about maintaining stealth and doing things discreetly. I think what we've seen through this period of escalation is no longer about stealth. No one worries about attribution. They worry about kind of pre-staging and getting effects and outcomes. And so I think we're going to see, increasingly, more visible activity. That's one. The second thing is, we've talked about escalation. It's gonna hyper accelerate. The last piece is I think the future is going to be about speed. We are in, if you think about like ChatGPT is like 3 years old, and so it's still, we're still in our infant days of AI, the AI acceleration. But China's heavily investing in AI. Their offensive cyber tradecraft is going to be AI enabled. They're going to be able to deliver effects and capabilities at pace that we never imagined. And as a nation, we're obviously investing heavily in AI and leading the world in many areas there. But the future is going to be defined by this AI-centric warfare, and it's going to be a fight.
I think you're right about that. Hypersonic, space, cyber, those are the big three cards we're looking at, all powered by AI.
And actually, just one last point. The other piece is just this whole continued fusion of cyber and the physical world. You mentioned space and hypersonics, and everything now is hyper-connected, and the future risk is more so not necessarily around enterprise and digital networks, but all of the physical world that is connected.
Bill?
I just want to amplify both of the comments of my colleagues here, which are spot on. I think, from my perspective, I'm going to boil it down to just Mark used 3 legs of a stool. I'm going to use two bicycle wheels here. As I talk about this in the corporate world with clients and in academia, I always use the 12-month rule, right? Because we went to 27, 26, 30. I don't think anybody really knows. So I use a 12-month rule. Let's pretend it happens in 12 months. I think 2 things fundamentally have to happen in the U.S. I'm looking at this specifically from a domestic landscape. Number one, we have to find a way to incentivize U.S. private equity and venture capital banks from not investing in Chinese capabilities and tools to enhance their ability to invade Taiwan. I mean, it's just problematic, right? We have to find a way to disincentivize that investment over there to help them on their civilian military capabilities. That's number one. Number 2 is domestic preparedness. Think about what we talked about here the last 40 minutes and talk about not only Salt Typhoon and mostly Volt Typhoon. We have to get in a position to enhance and be able to influence the corporate world to prepare for what's going to happen if Taiwan comes in the picture and China makes a decision. As Mark talked about,
and you have no chips available or anything else.
If you think that Volt Typhoon isn't predicated upon this, you're crazy, right? The ability to set the place, these disruptive capabilities, is primarily for when you make a decision to go to Taiwan. So there's no appetite and bad things happen here. We are not prepared for that. So my admonition is, domestically, regardless if it's in 2027 or 2030, we have to expeditiously get into place where we could harden ourselves so that railroad could work, the ports work, the electricity grids work. We're not ready. We're nowhere near ready, but we have to get there as soon as possible.
Well said. That will be the last word. There's so much more to unpack here. Let me just remind people, read our report. Gentlemen, thank you so much for spending some time with us today, for putting in the blood, sweat, and tears into our research here, and thank you. Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, man.
Humbled to be here.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.